With a goal of trying to provide more educational resources for businesses handling hazardous waste, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Hazardous Waste Management Bureau has created a series of presentations that deal with different aspects of hazardous waste management. For businesses that create or handle hazardous waste, knowing and understanding the rules around managing it legally is critical to compliance and environmental protection. This presentation is about determining if a waste is a regulated hazardous waste. To figure out if you make hazardous waste and what regulations you have to follow, you have to know what a hazardous waste is. This presentation is intended to give you a start towards understanding what can be a pretty complicated topic. In other words, this is the short version. If you want an explanation that's a little more detailed, I suggest you check out NHDES's YouTube channel for our 10-part video playlist on hazardous waste determinations. Figuring out if you have regulated hazardous waste is what we call a hazardous waste determination. We follow a series of steps to decide whether the waste meets any of the reasons we have for calling it hazardous. These 4 steps or questions are: is it a waste? Is it exempt from the rules? Is it a characteristic waste? Is it a listed waste? The first step in the waste determination process is to identify what waste you have. We went over this in an earlier presentation, and hopefully it helped you find the waste you make at your site. Once you have a list of items to review more closely, let's move on. If you watched our video titled, "What is a waste?" you remember that some wastes are used and easier to recognize, but some wastes can also be unused. Keep your eye open for those less obvious wastes. The second step is to review your waste to see if any of them are exempt. That means that for one reason or another, they aren't regulated, even if they might be dangerous. No, we're not crazy. It may be exempt because another environmental program already regulates that stuff well enough, so we don't need to add the burden of hazardous waste rules. Or it may be that the waste is highly recyclable, and regulating it as hazardous waste would make it difficult to recycle and not really benefit the environment. Whatever the reason, there is a list of about 50 different exemptions in the rules. Some of the more common ones for very small quantity generators, or VSQGs, are listed here on this slide. To review all of these exemptions, you can look at ENV HW 401.03 through our website. If you are having trouble finding our rules on the website, you can give our helpline a call at 603-271-2942 and we'll help you out. All hazardous wastes are identified with something called a waste number. You'll put these waste numbers on your waste containers and your shipping papers. These are mostly for the benefit of the business that receive your waste after you ship them off-site. These places are known as treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, or TSDFs. They have their own regulations to follow, and these numbers tell the TSDF what's dangerous about your waste, and therefore what safe and legal options they have for disposing or recycling them. Almost all waste numbers start with the letters P, U, F, K, or D, followed by 3 numbers. For example, P042, F003, and D001. There are a couple of other wastes that are identified with the letters NH, followed by 2 numbers, such as NH02. Keep in mind that waste can carry more than one number if it is hazardous for multiple reasons, and it is important to identify all of the waste codes that apply to each waste stream. How do you know what waste numbers to use? One way is to see if they are characteristic wastes. These wastes fail the standard we set for some dangerous property or characteristic, such as being corrosive or catching fire easily. These wastes have waste numbers that start with the letter D. There is another group of hazardous waste known as listed waste. There are 4 lists of dangerous chemicals in the hazardous waste rules. Almost all of these chemicals are on the list because they're toxic. A waste is a regulated hazardous waste if it contains a chemical on one of these lists and meets some other requirement. On one of those lists, all of the chemicals are given a waste number starting with the letter P. On another, all the waste numbers are given the letter U, and so on. Because of this, the 4 different lists are called the P list, the U list, the K list, and the F list. In addition to these characteristic and listed wastes, there are a couple of wastes that might not be considered hazardous by some states, but they are in New Hampshire. These New Hampshire-only wastes have their own waste number that start with the letters NH followed by a 2-digit number. We'll give more details on them later. One last thing to note is that you might see the NHX1 code on your manifest. This is not an actual hazardous waste code, but instead a code that lets NHDES know that your waste was recycled. If you ship more than 660 pounds of hazardous waste in a quarter and it is recycled, this code will exempt you from the hazardous waste quarterly reporting fee. However, you must keep your certificates of recycle to prove this. Now, let's look at these listed and characteristic wastes in more detail, starting with the characteristic wastes. We've gone through 2 steps of our waste determination so far. We've asked, is it a waste? And is it exempt? The 3rd step I want to talk about is determining if your waste is a characteristic hazardous waste. Again, characteristic is the term we use to mean that it has a dangerous property. There are 4 dangerous properties that we worry about: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. A waste is a hazardous waste if it fails the standard for any of these characteristics. So the question is, what are the standards? How ignitable is dangerous? How corrosive is dangerous? How reactive is dangerous? And how toxic is dangerous? Fortunately, we have answers. Let's look first at ignitability. When we say ignitable, it means that it's something that catches fire easily. But how easily is easily? Our rules say that if it is a liquid that has a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, then it is ignitable. Great, but what does that mean? What's a flash point? A flash point is figured out in a laboratory where a liquid waste is heated up and someone tries to set the vapors coming off the liquid on fire. The hotter it gets, the more vapors there are, and if heating it gives off enough vapor so they catch fire or flash, they check the temperature of the liquid. If it is less than 140 degrees, the liquid is ignitable. Not all wastes are liquid though. A solid can be ignitable too, although these aren't as common. Generally speaking, an ignitable solid is something that can catch on fire through friction, and then once it catches on fire, it really takes off. A lab will usually measure whether or not it burns vigorously by seeing how long it takes for a strip of the chemical to burn from one end to the other. Certain metal powders, if the metal is pure enough and fine enough, can catch on fire with frightening results. If you've ever used an over-the-counter hand warmer packet on a cold day, you've experienced this at a small scale. These packets are filled with iron fillings. Because the iron is pretty pure, it starts rusting at a really fast rate, just from being exposed to the air. It rusts so fast that it gives off heat. Fortunately, they don't get hot enough where they're regulated as hazardous waste. There are some materials, such as propane, that US DOT identifies as flammable gases. If you have any of these flammable gases on site and they're wastes, remember, we only regulate waste, we don't regulate product, then we would call them ignitable hazardous wastes. Lastly, there are some other chemicals, such as higher concentration hydrogen peroxides, that are called oxidizers. These chemicals give off oxygen that feed a fire even if there's no air, which makes them pretty dangerous. These are considered ignitable when they are a waste too. If you're worried now about the hydrogen peroxide in your bathroom cabinet being a hazardous waste, don't be. household hydrogen peroxide is usually about a 3% concentration. The stuff we worry about is an 8% concentration or more. Here are a couple of symbols to help you identify these things. If you see these on containers in your facility, consider whether or not they are a waste. If they are a waste, they're probably regulated as hazardous waste. Here are a few more common examples of ignitable hazardous waste. As a general rule of thumb, if a liquid waste evaporates fast, there's a good chance it's an ignitable hazardous waste. Remember, we worry about igniting vapors, so the more vapors there are, the more likely it will ignite. Aerosol cans that still contain product, or even just the propellant, are one of the examples of ignitable wastes. Sometimes the propellant is an ignitable gas, such as butane, and if there's still liquid in the can, it may be an ignitable solvent or similar chemical. Look for warning words on the can label, such as flammable, to give you clues to whether or not it catches fire easily. Another common waste stream that's ignitable is alcohol. Alcohol is commonly used as a cleaning solvent in the industry settings or as an antiseptic in healthcare facilities. If it is a waste, it is likely an ignitable hazardous waste. Auto body shops using paints are a very common source of ignitable wastes. If you've ever walked in an area where painting is going on, you're likely familiar with how much vapor there is in the air. Oil or solvent-based paints aren't used by just auto repair businesses, though. They are found in a lot of industries. Again, look for warning words and symbols on container labels to tip you off that these things may be regulated. As mentioned in our earlier presentation, take a very close look at flammable cabinets if you have them. These cabinets often become catch-alls for dangerous materials, since employees look to put dangerous stuff in a safe place. Flammable cabinets are also a favorite place for NHCES inspectors to look for violations. Adhesives are one more common waste stream that is often ignitable. We put adhesives on something and the liquid portion quickly evaporates, leaving the sticky part behind. Well, the evaporating part can often catch fire easily. Our second characteristic or dangerous property is corrosivity. These are wastes that are very strong acids or very strong basics. These are common industrial chemicals with the potential for serious harm. We've all heard stories about people suffering from acid or caustic burns. Usually a chemical is measured as a hazardous corrosive waste by looking at its pH. This can be done using things like a pH meter or a pH paper test strip. If the pH is lower than or equal to 2.0, we say that it's strong enough acid to be a hazardous waste. Also, if the pH is higher than or equal to 12.5, we say that it's so basic or caustic that it is also regulated as a hazardous waste. Measuring pH is only possible if the waste has water in it, though. If a chemical doesn't have water in it, there won't be a pH. Just because there's no water in it doesn't mean that it can't be corrosive. While not that common, there are some other corrosive wastes that can't be measured with pH, so a different lab test has to be used where they measure how fast it corrodes steel. Do you remember when I mentioned the waste number NHO2 earlier? Well, in New Hampshire, we also regulate wastes that are corrosive solids. There are some materials such as water treatment chemicals that are in solid form, like powder or pellets, that when mixed with water, they have a very high or very low pH. Since they can even absorb moisture out of the air, protecting yourself from these wastes isn't necessarily as easy as keeping them away from water. Here on the right is a scale to give you a sense of how acidic is considered a strong acid and how basic is considered a strong base. You can see that a pH of 2.0 is about as acidic as lemon juice. A pH of 12.5 is somewhere between ammonia and lye, a couple of pretty harsh chemicals. On the left are a couple of symbols that can help tell you if your material is a danger because it's acidic or basic. If you see these symbols on packages or containers, look closer to see if they would be considered a corrosive hazardous waste. In this photo, we have a metal plating line, a common process that makes corrosive waste. The processes here can use both chemicals that are very acidic and chemicals that are very caustic to treat metal or plastic parts. Here's a picture of a very corrosive solid that's destroying the container holding it and is spilling out onto the floor. Here is also an example of a typical pH test strip that you can use at your own facility. A third characteristic to review is called reactivity. Fortunately, most of us don't run into these wastes, but it's still important to understand them so you can identify them if they ever do show up. There's a few different reasons that a waste can be reactive. First, these wastes are often considered to be unstable, which means that they can explode or react violently with only a little bit of energy added to them. Some wastes only need to be bumped or even have a cap or lid removed from their container in order for them to blow up. Some materials like dynamite are designed to do this intentionally, but there are also certain chemicals that degrade or change into new, more dangerous chemicals when they're stored for a long period of time and can eventually become shock sensitive. A couple examples of these would be old ether or crystallized picric acid. Other wastes that are considered reactive if they react badly when they come into contact with water or air. We're all aware that some chemicals don't get along with each other, right? One example would be mixing bleach and ammonia, which would make deadly chlorine gas. But water and air are almost impossible to avoid. If you have a chemical that reacts dangerously if it mixes with water or air, you're going to have a really hard time keeping it safe. Should you ever stumble across an old container of something packaged in oil, it might be a reactive waste. The good news is, these are really uncommon. One last type of waste worth a quick mention is one that has enough cyanide or hydrogen sulfide that it would pose a danger to human health. Again, these fortunately are not common. On the left is a US DOT symbol used to identify a material that would be reactive if it was a waste. I don't think you need me to tell you this is dangerous. On the right are some old containers of sodium and potassium metal contained in jars filled with oil. These two metals in their pure form, along with the metal lithium, can pose a serious risk. If you run across something like this, don't handle it. Instead, call your emergency responders and NHDES immediately. So far, we've looked at the hazardous characteristics of ignitability, corrosivity, and reactivity. Our last of the four hazardous characteristics is toxicity. There are 40 different metals, pesticides, and other chemicals that are hazardous only if they are above a regulated concentration. The concentration is different for each and every metal or chemical and can be found in the New Hampshire Hazardous Waste Rules. These regulated concentrations are very small, in the parts per million range, because we're worried about them getting into groundwater and the harm they could do if they made it into people's wells. One example is lead. We all know that lead is dangerous, and it's one of the metals in the toxicity characteristic. We regulate it if a test shows that it's just 5 parts per million or more. A special test is used to measure that concentration called the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure that can be done only by a qualified lab. It's designed to figure out how much of the bad stuff, in this case lead, would leach out if the waste was buried in the ground, such as if you had wood with lead-based paint buried in a landfill. This is another reason why businesses need to be really familiar with the waste that it makes. It's not always that easy to know if your waste contains very small amounts of these dangerous metals and chemicals and would therefore be regulated. You would have to look closely at the ingredients on the product you use and at what contaminants might be getting in there when you're using them too. For instance, processes that use acids or bases can corrode plumbing, and the metals in the plumbing can get in the waste. Another example is a process where there are moving metal parts that can wear down over time, and the metals again contaminate the waste stream. or simply washing stainless steel or brass parts, which may leach chromium and lead into a parts washer that may have been non-hazardous before use, but is now contaminated after it's been used. This slide shows just some of the toxic characteristic metals and chemicals and their waste numbers. The column on the right shows the concentration at which we worry about this stuff. We use the term milligrams per liter, but if it's easier for you, you can just call it parts per million. There are many possible toxic hazardous waste streams, but there are just a couple of possibilities to consider. Metals are often used as part of a chemical that gives paints, dyes, and inks their colors. While manufacturers are getting better at making coloring agents that don't contain regulated metals, some still do, and you'll want to keep your eyes open for them. There are also some fairly common chemicals that are toxic that aren't metals. A few examples are methyl ethyl ketone, or MEK, and prechloroethylene, also known as tetrachloroethylene, which is a common solvent, especially in spray can cleaners. That takes care of our third step. Is it a characteristic waste? So let's move on to our fourth and final step. Is it a listed hazardous waste? You'll remember that I said that there are 4 lists of chemicals that are regulated if they are your waste and meet some other criteria. They're known as the P, U, K, and F list. Of those, 2 of them, the P and U list, describe chemicals that have never been used. Examples of these might be a gallon of paint thinner that you will never use because you don't do the process that needed it anymore. Or it might be something like when a product on a retail store shelf is damaged or past its expiration date, it's never been used, but it's still a waste if they can't sell it. The other 2 listed chemicals, known as the K and F list, describe chemicals that have been used in a process at a business. These chemicals are regulated not just because of the type of chemical used, but also because of the way they were used at the business. One common example of this would be waste toluene that was used as a solvent. It would have to be the chemical toluene, and it would have to have been used as solvent to be considered a listed hazardous waste. So, used and unused. A waste can be one or the other, but it can never be both. If your waste is used, you don't have to worry about the chemicals on the P or U list. On the other hand, if your waste is unused, you do have to worry about the chemicals on the P and U list, but not those on the K and F list. Again, the list of regulated unused chemicals are the P list and the U list. The P list is special because it's reserved for the most dangerous chemicals, those that could do serious damage in even small quantities. These are the acutely hazardous wastes I mentioned in an earlier presentation introducing the self-certification program. Many of these are medicines or pesticides, very helpful in the right amount, but deadly if they get in the wrong place or in the wrong amount. The U list, on the other hand, is for chemicals that are also toxic, but not quite as bad as those on the P list. Remember that in order to be regulated, these chemicals must be unused. If it has gone through a process, it can't be a P or a U listed waste. One other important thing to know is that in order for an unused chemical or product to be on these lists is if they have one sole active ingredient that is listed. If there are other active ingredients required in order to make the product effective, it would not be listed even though it contains a chemical on these lists. For example, Hornet spray may have, let's say, 98.6% inert ingredients and 1.4% of a chemical to actually kill the bugs. If it is the only chemical, it's the sole active ingredient. Here's a picture of a small section of the P list. You can see that they're identified as acutely hazardous in the title. This is an image of a section of the U list. While these chemicals look pretty intimidating too, they're a little more common. You may recognize acetone in this list. It's a common solvent, and if disposed of when it isn't used, it can be a U-listed hazardous waste. Fortunately, most businesses don't make P-listed acutely hazardous waste. But if you work in the healthcare industry or have a lab, the odds are more likely that you do. A couple of common examples are shown here on the screen, include a common blood thinning medication and nicotine, which is also used in the vaping industry. Make sure that you take a thorough inventory to identify your waste and any products that you have that may become a waste later on. You want to be careful to identify these wastes because of their danger, but also because of the way they can impact how you're regulated. Remember from our introduction to the self-certification program presentation that you only need to have 2.2 pounds of acutely hazardous waste to become a highly regulated hazardous waste generator. We've talked about the first two lists that describe certain chemical wastes that haven't been used. Now let's take a closer look at the other two lists that describe wastes that have been used, the F list and the K list. The F list describes certain chemicals that, when used in certain ways, are regulated regardless of how concentrated the chemicals are when you're done. In the New Hampshire hazardous waste rules, there are 28 different wastes on this list. Of those, there are 13 that are way more common than the others. The first 5 F-listed wastes, F001 through F005, are chemicals that have been used as solvents. These are by far the most common F-listed wastes, and if you work with solvents, you want to pay close attention to the description of these wastes in the rules. The second most common are those described in F006 through F019. These wastes are made through chemical metalworking, that is, using chemicals to add to or remove material from a component, such as in industrial plating or etching operations. The last of the 4 hazardous waste lists is the K list. These lists are made by only 13 types of businesses, and only a few of which occur in our state. However, one type of business, foundries that pour molten metal into forms, are capable of making a couple of these wastes. We do have several foundries in New Hampshire, and if your business has this type of process, you should become familiar with those K-listed wastes. Here's a few examples of where a very small quantity generator might find F-listed wastes. The first is spray can cleaners. These cleaning solutions often use chemical solvents that fit the descriptions for F001 through F005 wastes. The same is true with spent paint thinners. This third photo shows a solvent still. If you have a solvent recycler at your facility, be aware that the residues left behind in that unit may be regulated as F001 through F005 waste 2. Lastly, this photo shows a typical metal plating operation, a common process that can create F006 through F019 wastes. Here's an example of typical hazardous waste made by 4 different but common types of businesses. If your business is one of these 4 types, this can give you an idea of things to look for. Both auto body shops and printers frequently use significant amount of solvents. These are often ignitable, and some wastes may also be toxic. Healthcare facilities are the most likely to have unused listed waste, but can also have a fair amount of ignitable waste because of the alcohol and some other solvents they use in the lab. Manufacturing industries vary in what they create, but they're most likely to generate ignitables and corrosives. Toxic characteristic wastes are also common at these facilities. It might be difficult to be accurate with your waste determination, but that's why we're here. While it's ultimately the responsibility of the business to get it right, we're available to guide you in taking the right steps and getting the right information. You'll need to pull together all the information you have about your waste to come to the decision that you have confidence in. That includes documentation such as product labels, safety data sheets, previous test results, and your own knowledge of what happens in the process. In some cases, the only way to know if your waste is hazardous is to have a lab test it. In any case, file that information away so you can have proof on how you made your decision if asked. If you feel it isn't worth the cost of a lab test or the time to research if the waste is hazardous or not, you can be conservative and call it a hazardous waste without proof. You'll still need a good idea on why it's hazardous though, so that way you know what waste numbers could apply. Guessing that your waste isn't hazardous is a bad decision without some background documentation like what I just described. If you, or worse, an inspector, find out years later after the fact that you illegally disposed of a hazardous waste, even if you didn't know it, you may be assessed a fine. NHDES, your transporters, and consultants are available to provide guidance. But again, you are the generator, and ultimately it is your responsibility to determine if your waste is hazardous. Nobody should know more about the waste and your process than you do. Now we will jump a little bit sideways and talk briefly about used oil for recycle. Used oil is a hazardous waste, but if it is recycled and meets other criteria, it can be regulated under less stringent rules and doesn't count towards your monthly generator amounts or impact your generator status. However, we should still talk about this waste stream in this training. Used oil for recycle is any oil that is recycled for reuse or being burned for energy or fuel use. Used oil for recycle is not anything that has been used as a solvent or cleaner and is not anything mixed with hazardous waste. Used oil for recycle must be labeled with the words used oil for recycle. They must be stored in closed containers on an impervious surface, and if stored outside, the containers must be covered and stored in a secondary containment. You should not mix anything in with your used oil for recycle. Used oil for recycle has value. If you mix in waste with your oil to dispose of it, you are contaminating it and will then need to manage it as hazardous waste. If you're not burning your oil in your own used oil burner, you must ship your waste off with a used oil transporter or a registered used oil marketer. If your neighbor has a used oil burner, you can't automatically give them your oil. One of you would have to register with NHDES as a used oil marketer before the trade takes place. This is a free process. When shipping your used oil off, you must be sure to keep documentation of any used oil shipments for at least 3 years. If you do burn used oil in a used oil burner, you must register your burner with NHDES. Lastly, we talked about New Hampshire specific codes. NH01 is used for oil that is hazardous. If the used oil is for recycling, use NHX1. When recycling your used oil, be sure to keep recycling documentation as proof. Again, if your oil is not being recycled, use NH01. If your used oil is being recycled, use code NHX1. Universal wastes are also still hazardous. However, like used oil for recycle, they can be regulated under less stringent rules and won't count towards your monthly generation amounts or impact your generator status, so long as you are managing them correctly. Some of the main requirements for universal waste is that they should be stored in closed containers, except for cathode ray tubes or CRTs, which are old school computer monitors and TVs. You should never intentionally crush or break fluorescent lamps or CRTs to reduce volume. If you do, you will release hazardous waste, such as mercury, into the environment and create additional hazardous waste to dispose of. All containers should be labeled as universal waste and then what the waste stream is. If stored outside, the containers must be covered. Universal waste can only be accumulated on-site for up to 1 year from the date it was generated. Here are some examples of proper and improper universal waste storage for fluorescent lamps. On the left, the boxes are closed, the label is clearly visible, it has the words universal waste on them, and the boxes are positioned in a way where they won't tip over and potentially break the bulbs inside. The image on the right, however, the box is open, there's no label that we can see, and the lamps are starting to fall out of the box. This puts them at a greater risk of breaking, and fluorescent bulbs do have mercury in them. Figuring out if you have hazardous waste is a pretty intimidating thing, and it may be that you just as soon avoid it and plead ignorance. Unfortunately, we already know that's not a successful defense. Instead, if you'd like help with identifying if your wastes are hazardous, we have resources available. However, NHDES is not meant to serve as an official consultant. You may have to reach out to a hazardous waste consultant or your transporter for a more in-depth review of your process and waste streams. This concludes our brief introduction on determining if your waste is a hazardous waste. If you'd like a little more detail on this topic, please review our 10-part waste determination series on our YouTube channel. We also have more presentations to help you understand these regulations and other regulations. If you'd just like to talk to a person, we want to help. Give us a call at one of the numbers on your screen during normal working hours. Please leave a message if we don't connect and we'll return your call. If email is your preference, we've got you covered. You can reach us at vsqg@des.nh.gov or hwcomp@des.nh.gov.